Oh, good morning, pros. Here, of course, good afternoon to my wonderful and favorite eighth period class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my last lecture as we are wrapping up the month of March. Boy, has this month gone quickly. We were marching in the spring for over 4 weeks, but now we're going to be fast approaching the month of April. And always remember, April showers always bring May flowers. All right. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So at this point, you should have on your desk, you should have your ISN. You should have your ISN open to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. It's a new day, it's a new date, ergo it's a new page. Top right-hand corner, you've already done this. Make certain that your notes have been dated for today. It is March 31st, it's 2022. Every single page in your ISN, should be dated, and it should either have a topic heading for direct instructional notes or an assignment heading for a TCI assignment. So I want you to write down for me the Marshall Plan, because this is going to be another one of the major significant accomplishments of Harry Truman's. So the Marshall Plan basically picks up from where the Truman Doctrine basically left off. Remember how we talked about the Truman Doctrine in 1947? We provided military and economic aid to Turkey and Greece because we did not want either country to fall into the hands of communism with the Soviet Union, and it worked really, really well. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the Truman Doctrine and we're going to bring it to another level. Now, I need you to write this down. So this again is the fifth major accomplishment of Harry Truman's presidency as our first Cold War president. Now, in order to understand, again, the Marshall Plan, you definitely need to know something about the Truman Doctrine, which we've already talked about, and I just summarized just a few moments ago. But again, I want to go back to a topic that was introduced to you guys with my last Zoomcast, and it goes back to the year 1946. So in 1946, this very significant player, the average American doesn't understand and needs to understand how important this gentleman is. His name was George F. Kennan. So George F. Kennan worked for the State Department. He was probably, again, I don't know if he knew, but the same State Department with Alger Hiss. So I want to talk a little bit more about Kennan. And I want to talk more about what's called the long telegram. And it's this long telegram that basically becomes the foundation of what will eventually become this policy of containment. And it's going to be this policy of containment then that's going to greatly influence what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, which is not just the foreign policy of Harry Truman, but many other subsequent presidents after Truman, Dwight David Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Richard M. Nixon, Gerald R. Ford, James Earl Carter, Ronald Reagan, and finally, George H.W. Bush. Every one of those presidents all embraced the same foreign policy that was based upon, again, originally going back to Harry Truman with the Truman Doctrine, which was part of this, again, policy, which is known as containment. And it all goes back to the long telegram, of George F. Kennan. All right, let's continue on. So what's the key point regarding George F. Kennan? I keep saying Kennan, it's Kennan. So George F. Kennan basically said that the key to stopping communism, Soviet-style communism, was to block it and basically prevent it from spreading throughout Europe. In other words, again, you may not be able to go into the countries where it's already taken root. Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. Those countries at this point, from Kennan's point of view, it's too far gone. Rather, focus on the countries that might be susceptible, like, again, Greece and Turkey. And there are other countries in Europe also that are on the brink. Austria, the rest of Germany, Italy, France, all of these countries, the Low Countries, again, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, all these countries were in dire straits right now and very easily could have been taken over by the Soviet Union. So Kennan, in this long telegram, is going to propose a way in which the United States could stop the Soviet, again, further advancement and aggression into other parts of Eastern Europe. So what I'd like everybody to do is I want you to skip a full page and I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Once again, I would like everybody to date your notes for today. It's March 31st, 2022. And before we get into the Marshall Plan, I want to really go into more depth on the long telegram of George F. Kennan. Because again, if you want to understand the policy, the foreign policy, our approach in trying to stop the Soviet Union from continuing and advancing and taking over all of Europe and spreading communism, if you want to understand the Truman Doctrine really, and you really want to understand the Marshall Plan, which I'll be talking about shortly, you have to understand the long telegram of George F. Kennan. So I'm going to provide you some guide questions in this video clip. Are you ready? Here we go. Number one, pardon me. Name 3 issues that divided the United States and the Soviet Union based on this video clip. And I also want you to be thinking about, remember we did those 3 T charts? We were comparing, contrasting the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War. There is a definite correlation between the two. Now, I'm going to go through these guide questions relatively quickly because I know you have the ability, because it's a Zoom cast, you can pause it to give yourself a chance to get caught up. Skip a line or 2. Number 2, so tell me more. Who is George F. Kennan? Number 3, how did Kennan describe the Soviet Union? So what I like about this video clip, and by the way, this is brand new. I literally just found this on YouTube and I just downloaded it into my computer and now I'm uploading it into the PowerPoint and I'm now sharing it with you with the Zoomcast. I think it does a nice job of not just talking about the long telegram and who was George F. Kennan, but also, again, its impact on the Truman Doctrine, on the Marshall Plan, and going forward for the next 45 years of history when you're looking at the relationship between the United States, the Soviet Union, and then in the middle would be the continent of Europe. Next guide question, what were Kennan's conclusions on how to best deal with the Soviet Union? This, again, is your foundation. This is your blueprint of how the United States is going to try to thwart Joseph Stalin, who seemingly, again, had been making promises. Go back to Yalta. Remember how Stalin was talking about, yes, we're going to have free elections in Eastern Europe. And yes, I'll allow democracy to take root. He was lying. He had never had any intention of it, as we found out. Next guide question. What did Kennan's long telegram, or why, let me rephrase that. Why did George F. Kennan's long telegram make such an important impact on American history? And again, the average American probably doesn't even know who George F. Kennan is. They should, because this guy is going to play a huge role in the molding and shaping of world history, not just US history, but world history for over 45 years. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, this video clip is about 3 minutes long. It is time well spent. George F. Kennan, the long telegram, and the policy of containment. Here we go.
By 1946, relations were worsening between the United States and the Soviet Union over issues such as Eastern Europe, Germany, and the atomic bomb. Confused and perplexed, H. Freeman Matthews, head of the European desk at the State Department, contacted the American Embassy in Moscow for suggestions. On February the 22nd, 1946, he received from the embassy charge d'affaires, George F. Kennan, what has been called the most influential telegram ever sent inside the government, the long telegram. Kennan was a career Foreign Service officer who was considered an expert on Russia and the Soviet Union. In this message, he explained his view of the behavior of the Soviets in graphic terms. They were hard to get along with because beneath their neurotic view of world affairs lay traditional Russian fear of foreigners and insecurity. They also used the fig leaf of Marxism to protect their personal power by continuous foreign expansion. Kennan stressed that the United States could not negotiate with them, that they were, according to him, living in an atmosphere of Oriental secretiveness and conspiracy, and a disrespect for objective truth. Kennan's conclusions were that all Soviet actions would be negative and destructive in character. But on the other hand, they were highly sensitive to the logic of force. Kennan believed that the Russians can easily withdraw, and usually do, when strong resistance is encountered at any point. Kennan was, in a sense, promoting his future policy of containment, the American attempt to stop future Soviet expansionism by political, economic, and military means. There is also little doubt that Kennan connected what he viewed as a Soviet threat with American reform at home. Kennan's telegram spread throughout the United States government, first reaching American ambassador to Russia, Averell Harriman, and would within a few weeks become the official policy of American policymakers in fighting the Cold War, thanks in part to Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who reproduced it and, in the later words of Kennan, evidently made it required reading for hundreds, if not thousands, of higher officers in the armed forces. Pressure was now put on the Soviet Union by the United States to evacuate northern Iran. Future loans for democratic but Soviet-leaning Czechoslovakia were cut off, and plans were beginning to be put into place to assist Turkey and Greece. This would be a major part of U.S. foreign policy for the next 50 years. There are a variety of reasons why Kennan's telegram made such an impact. One reason must be the diplomat's writing style. Kennan used metaphors that attracted the attention of government higher-ups. Another reason must be that the cable arrived in Washington during a crucial time when officials were searching for a clear explanation of Soviet behavior and American response. George Kennan's telegram had a great impact in radically changing American foreign policy in the post-war period.
Great video clip. I'm so glad that you guys had the opportunity of watching that. So a couple of takeaways. Number one, again, I think one of the takeaways I have from watching the video clip and understanding the long telegram of George F. Kennan is it really provided the American leadership, Harry Truman and his inner circle, his cabinet, some clarity and understanding the Soviet mindset. This was, again, very confusing and perplexing to a lot of folks, again, in the government. Why suddenly has this marriage between these two former allies, now bitter enemies? What went wrong? And again, Kennan's long telegram provided some much needed clarity. And then number two, I'm going to dovetail back to something I said earlier. Again, this long telegram becomes, again, the foundation for this policy of containment. The policy of containment then basically leads the way to the Truman Doctrine. And then the Truman Doctrine is, of course, become part of what we call the Marshall Plan, or it basically inspires it. And so when you go back to this policy of containment and the Truman Doctrine, it's not just Harry Truman's foreign policy. It becomes the foreign policy under Harry Truman, Dwight David Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald R. Ford, James Earl Carter, Ronald Reagan, and then finally, George H.W. Bush. So you're looking at 9 different American presidents. And you should mention that as a side oral note. 9 American presidents are all going to embrace basically what started in 1946 when George F. Kennan wrote that long telegram. Hugely influential. All right, go back to the previous page. Now we're going to go back to my direct instructional notes. All right. So once again, I just want to summarize the policy of containment, and then we're going to get into the Marshall Plan. So the policy of containment, which is based upon George F. Kennan's long telegram, 1946, was important, and I'm going to give you guys 2 reasons why. Number one, here's the good news. Kennan again provided clarity to the American leadership, especially our first Cold War president, Harry Truman, who was again baffled by the behavior of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. Because of this policy of containment, which is based on the long telegram, which will inspire the Truman Doctrine, which will inspire the Marshall Plan, which you're going to learn about shortly, communism will not spread throughout Western and Central Europe. It's going to basically be stopped. And you're going to go back to when we talked about that Iron Curtain that it has descended across Europe. And then number 2, as Kennan predicted, he said that if you can isolate Soviet-style communism from spreading, he predicted that the day would come without military force that eventually the Soviet Union and Soviet-style communism would eventually break apart. And as we know, that's exactly what happened. So again, my second year at beautiful Aptekissick Junior High, again, the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, will eventually break down in December of 1991, ending, of course, what we call the Cold War. But again, when this all happened, nobody would have ever been able to look into that crystal ball at that point to see here we are in 2022. We are definitely in a Cold War, but this time it's not with the Soviet Union, it's with Russia. But now it's turned hot, and that's the difference between the two. So hopefully, again, cooler heads will prevail. But again, we talk about why do we study things that happened in the past? Because it helps to mold and shape and explain what's going on right now in the present in 2022. All right, I want you to write this quote down for me. So this quote was attributed to our old friend, Winston Churchill, former British Prime Minister during World War II, of course, flashing his famous V for victory. The cradle of Western civilization was a rubble heap, a breeding ground for pestilence and hatred. So that was Winston Churchill, basically post-World War II. So what was he describing at that point? And I would draw a line off to the side. He was describing Europe. He was basically saying that because of what the Nazis had done for the last 6 years, Europe had a serious cleaning up process, but they were weak and vulnerable at this point. And the point that Churchill was making is that they were weak and vulnerable to a point where it's very possible that now the Soviet Union would replace Nazi Germany as basically the dominant force of the continent. And so it was Churchill who basically is saying, unless something is done to help Europe rebuild itself, he was basically predicting there was a good chance that the Soviet Union would fill that void that was vacated when Nazi Germany was defeated eventually on VE Day, May 8th, 1945. All right, I'd like you to write this down. So in June of 1947, I'm going to introduce to you another key player in the Cold War. His name is George Marshall. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that's a photograph of George Marshall. Now, a couple of things about George Marshall. I would draw a line or two off to the side. This is, again, a good example. You've got to be adding more additional information, not just the main notes. That's not good enough anymore. Marshall was a huge player in World War II, greatly influential. He was the one during World War II that when America became involved, President Roosevelt had gone to George Marshall, who was one of the biggest players in the United States military, and said, I need somebody to basically defeat the Nazis in Europe. And it was George Marshall, without flinching, basically recommended to President Roosevelt. And I would add a side note, his number one choice was Dwight David Eisenhower. Good choice. And number two, now George Marshall in 1947 is no longer in the American military, but now he is Secretary of State under Harry Truman. But George Marshall brings, again, a military background to the position of Secretary of State. So the story is that George Marshall is going to make a speech, a very influential speech to Harvard University graduates. And this is what he said. So you guys don't need to write this part down. I just want you to listen. Here we go. I'm quoting again, Secretary of State George Marshall. Quote, it is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health of the world, without which there would be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but rather against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. George Marshall, 1947. So basically what Marshall is saying is he's dovetailing off of what Winston Churchill had said earlier. And that is, if the United States does not work collaboratively in rebuilding Europe, not make the mistake it made after World War I when we went back to our isolationist ways and became a neutral country, but stayed involved in Europe's rebuilding, that would be the only way that Europe would be stabilized and strong enough to stop the Soviet Union from eventually taking over the entire continent and spreading communism, throughout the entire land. All right, so now here's what's going to happen. I'm going to talk now about the Marshall Plan. So basically what George Marshall's going to be doing, he's given the green light by President Harry Truman. This is dovetailing off of the success of the Truman Doctrine. It was highly successful propping up Greece and Turkey with the $400 million in military and economic aid. It worked. Neither country succumbed to Soviet-style communism. But this is going to be on a much bigger scale than just two countries. So number one, the Marshall Plan is going to specifically target Western Europe. Specifically, even more specifically, France is going to get a big chunk of dough. France was decimated as a result of Nazi occupation from 1940 through 1944. England. Now, England's part of Great Britain. Remember, with Great Britain, you also have Scotland, you got Wales, and you also have part of Northern Ireland. But it was England, the part of Great Britain that suffered the most during the Battle of Britain. It was decimated by those nightly raids we know as the Blitz, of course, as part of the Battle of Britain with the Luftwaffe. West Germany, by the way, you notice I'm saying West Germany because now in 1947, there's not one Germany. There's two Germanys, and it's going to stay that way until 1989, a year before I started at beautiful AJHS. Italy, also devastated during the war itself, especially after Italy had switched sides in 1943 after Mussolini was deposed. And again, Italy had made the decision to join the Allied powers. So from 1947 through 1951, all of these different places in Europe, primarily in Western and Central Europe, and I should also include Austria with this as well, they would receive over $13 billion. And that's in the currency of the time. You convert that into today's currency, that easily exceeds over $100 billion between 1947 through 1951 through what's called the OEEC. So the OEEC is an acronym that stands for the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. So this organization was created to, again, allocate and determine who's going to get what piece of the pie, and using this money to basically rebuild Europe after the devastation of World War II. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that, of course, is a photograph of the OEEC. Now, before we get into some guide questions, I'd like you to draw a line off to the side regarding the Marshall Plan. Now, there is a little catch with it. Number one, now, even though I wrote down Western Europe, I want to emphasize the Marshall Plan was open to everybody. So I would make a little side note. Anybody could apply for it, and that included Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia, which was under, at this point, Soviet Union influence, its hegemony, had wanted a piece of the Marshall Plan, and sadly, Joseph Stalin denied it its right to do so. We even offered a military, or not military, we provided some economic assistance to the Soviet Union. We offered through the Marshall Plan to rebuild the Soviet Union as well. But the catch was that if you were to take money from the United States as part of the Marshall Plan, you were basically required to buy American goods, which most of Europe was more inclined to do. They were fine with that. The Soviets, not so much. Stalin was concerned, A, that if you're borrowing money from the United States, then you're beholden to the United States. And they did not want that to happen, or he didn't want that to happen. He felt, number two, if you start taking the money from the United States through the Marshall Plan, the United States would be more closely monitoring the economic system of the Soviet Union. And again, as Kennan pointed out, the Soviets were very, very quiet and very closed-mouthed and confidential. They didn't want this information to be getting out to the United States. So Stalin, even though it was offered economic assistance through the Marshall Plan, he simply said no. And all the other countries in Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany, because remember, Germany was split in half, all of them are going to basically deny the opportunity of taking advantage of the Marshall Plan. Okay, now I want you guys to go back, and I want you to skip a full page. I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Don't do this on the back. Don't continue on. This is a new set of notes. Once again, I want you to date your notes for today. It is March 31st. We're wrapping up the month of March 2022. And I want you to write down for me guide questions, the Marshall Plan. So I found this video clip actually last year. And this video clip does a nice job of tying together exactly what the Marshall Plan was about, its connection, its correlation with the Truman Doctrine, and of course, George F. Kennan's policy of containment, which was part of the long telegram. Again, you notice the way I'm weaving all this information together. It's not memorizing dates and facts on a flashcard. Rather, it's being able to take this information, and I say this again and again, telling a story. Here we go. Number one, I'm going to go through these guy questions quickly because I know you're going to pause the Zoomcast. One, what was the goal of the Marshall Plan? Skip a line or two. Number two, what were the other reasons why the Marshall Plan was created between 1947 through 1951? I just gave you a general overview. The video clip's going to go into more detail. Number three, who did not receive aid from the Marshall Plan? I've already alluded to this earlier. Let's see if you were paying attention. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so we're going to get into our second video clip, which will be fair game for your next assessment. Here we go, the Marshall Plan.
Hooray! World War II is over, but Europe is in ruins. What can a country like the United States do to help? How about setting aside over $13 billion to help rebuild the smoldering continent? That's what the European Recovery Plan, aka the Marshall Plan, sought to do. Restore the European economy by giving foreign aid to countries that needed it. It was a brilliant move to win the peace by George C. Marshall, the plan's creator. Marshall had been a career military man, and during the war had served as the Army's chief of staff. He oversaw the U.S. military strategy and was one of the key figures behind the Allied victory. Marshall retired from the Army at the end of the war, where President Truman valued his brains too much. After serving as ambassador to China, Marshall was appointed Secretary of State in early 1947. Soon after, he developed his European Recovery Plan and announced it in June of that year. From April 1948 to December 1951, the United States shipped food, fuel, machinery, and money to European countries. The goal was to help them get back on their feet after the devastation of the war. In one sense, this was good deed foreign policy. The United States was being a friend, using its considerable resources to help war-torn Europe. Plus, the last time the world left a conquered nation in ruins, Nazi Germany rose to power. But there were other reasons to implement the Marshall Plan as well. By investing in the economies of European countries, the U.S. helped create new markets for its exports. Perhaps we could interest you in a Buick. There was a strategic objective too. The U.S. wanted to isolate the Soviet Union, to keep it from expanding its sphere of influence beyond Eastern Europe. How better to make capitalism appealing than to spread around money in a war-torn country? By the way, here are all the countries that received Marshall Plan aid in alphabetical order. Ready? Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and West Germany. Now, if you listen closely, you might have noticed a couple of major European countries that weren't on that list. The USSR didn't trust the US intentions with the Marshall Plan and forbade Poland and Czechoslovakia from receiving American aid. Too bad for them, because the plan worked. The gross national product of Marshall Plan countries grew as much as 25%. It put Western European industry back on its feet. The American export economy boomed, and Soviet-influenced communism was contained to Eastern Europe. Nice work, George Marshall. In 1953, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. The greater honor for Marshall, though, may have been seeing Europe rise from the ashes, thanks in part to the plan that bears his name.
Couple of takeaways. What a great video clip. I thought he did a nice job. So number one, again, what George Marshall was able to successfully do was avoid the mistakes that were made after World War I. And that is the United States is going to be much more actively involved in, again, the process of not just rebuilding Europe, but also stabilizing it. And literally from 1947 all the way until 2022, Europe had not witnessed a major significant war. Now, obviously, things have changed fairly recently, but for an extended period of time, Europe had experienced peace and prosperity that it had not seen in literally since the days of the Roman Empire, and that was thousands of years ago. So it worked splendidly well, by the way. But again, The key is to understand the influence of the Truman Doctrine and, of course, the policy of containment as a result of the long telegram. All right, now I want you to go back again to your regular set of notes and let's get back into my direct instruction. Here we go. So the Marshall Plan, I'm going to tie this all together in a nice, tight, pretty bow. What's important, and I'm going to provide everybody 3 reasons why, dovetailing off of what you just learned about in that really well done video clip. Number 1, again, this was alluded to in the video clip. Because of this influx of much needed, again, money and the process of rebuilding, Europe was able to rebuild its industrial base, which had been decimated and destroyed as a result of the Nazis' occupation in many of these countries during World War II. And so by the time you get to post 1951, 1952, Europe is now producing at a much better clip at over 40% improvement as compared to the war years. So obviously, the Marshall Plan has provided that influx of much needed capital that was necessary for Europe to rebuild its factories, rebuild its industry, and get itself back on its feet again. Number 2, this is even more important. I would put a big asterisk by it. It really did promote the economic recovery of Europe. Huge. Just like the Truman Doctrine helped save Greece and Turkey from falling under the spell and the hegemony, the influence of the Soviet Union, the same thing for the rest of Europe. Because of this economic recovery, it was strong enough to stop the Soviets from expanding any further west. And it's again because of that influx of the $13 billion. By the way, I did a little research on this. $13 billion in 1947, if you look at it in today's currency, it would be $163,897,937,219.73. So that amount went up exponentially. I told you it was well over, again, over $100 billion in economic aid. Unbelievable. And as I stated earlier, let's really emphasize this as a key point. Because Europe was stabilizing economically, it was able to stop Soviet aggression from expanding, of course, further and further west. And it also paved the way for something that I alluded to earlier, and that's peace. From 1945, well, if you want to go with the Marshall Plan, let's go 1947 until literally March of 2022, until Russia invaded Ukraine. Europe had not experienced one major significant war, and that's because of the Marshall Plan. And boy, oh boy, could we use this again. Let's continue on. And then finally, number 3, the other reason why the Marshall Plan was important is because, again, I go back to the lessons of history. Woodrow Wilson was an internationalist. See how I'm going back to Wilson? Wilson's been gone for a long time. Died in 1923. But again, the influence of Wilson lives on. Wilson was an internationalist. He believed that the United States should stay involved in Europe's affairs to stabilize it. We didn't. We saw what happened. You saw the rise of Hitler, the rise of Nazi Germany, and the beginning of World War II. Now that the war is over, and yes, Franklin Roosevelt had died unexpectedly, but Roosevelt's vision was the United States was not going to walk away from Europe the way it did after World War I, and Harry Truman did believe the same thing. So what the Marshall Plan has done, in conjunction with the Truman Doctrine, so the Truman Doctrine's success leads to the Marshall Plan, but both of these are due to the policy of containment and the long telegram of George F. Kennan. And what the Marshall Plan did was, because we have such a heavy investment, all this money, the $13 billion that we invested in Europe, both Western and Central Europe, we want to make certain that we reap the benefits of our investment, and it paved the way for America's much greater involvement in European affairs to help stabilize the continent. This is a great photograph. In 2008, then presidential candidate Barack Obama is going to visit. This is Berlin, Germany. And notice the crowds that came out. Again, especially Germany in particular was most grateful because the United States did not make the mistake that was made after World War I when Germany was punished excessively through the war guilt clause. Yes, the Nazis were held accountable through, of course, the Nuremberg war crimes trials, but we made a point to not punish the German people. And we helped rebuild Germany. And Germany today is one of the most, if not the most vibrant democracies and capitalistic societies in all of Europe, and one of our closest allies. The German people are extremely grateful for what the United States did in rebuilding its country through primarily the Marshall Plan. Let's continue on. So here's what I want everybody to do. Skip a couple pages, go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. We're going to take a new set of notes because it's a new topic. All right, so once again, I would like everybody to date your notes again for today. It is March 31st, 2022, and I want you to write down for me the Berlin Airlift, because that is going to be the sixth and final accomplishment that we're going to cover today in the presidency of Harry S. Truman. So in order to understand the Berlin Airlift, I think again about, boy, am I being repetitive. I think about George F. Kennan, excuse me, I keep saying Kennan, George F. Kennan, and I think about the long telegram and the policy of containment. All right, so to understand the Berlin Airlift, I want you to write this down. So it's spring, and it's 1948. War ended basically 3 years earlier in Europe. So in spring of 1948, the Soviet Union is now starting to show greater acts of aggression. That word's coming back again. And what the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin is going to do is to cut off West Berlin from the Allies. Now, the question, of course, is why? Now, before we go any further, this, of course, is a map of Berlin. This was the capital of Germany, Nazi Germany. Now, I want you to notice that Berlin was basically, as a city, divided into 4 parts. And I would draw a line off to the side. So here we go. This part of Berlin, this is called East Berlin. That was, again, controlled by the Soviets. This part of Berlin was controlled by the French. This part of Berlin was controlled by the Brits. And this part of Berlin was controlled by the Americans. Now, eventually what's going to happen is these 3 parts are going to all come together, and that's going to become known as West Berlin. You should make an oral note about that. But this part will stay under the Soviet sphere of influence. That's East Berlin. And this, see that black line? That's your line of demarcation. Eventually, Berlin is going to be split in half physically by what we call the Berlin Wall. All right, let's go back. So what was Stalin's motivation? Real simple, write this down. So by basically cutting off West Berlin from the Americans, the Brits, and the French, what Stalin was trying to do was to force the Americans out of Berlin. And his ultimate goal was to force the Americans and the Brits and the French completely out of all of Germany. So that this way, what Stalin could do is take both parts of Germany. Remember, Germany had been split in half. You had Eastern Germany, which the Soviets controlled, and you had West Germany. And that was under the control of the Allies, the Brits, the Americans, and of course, the French. So he wants to get all the Allies out, and then Stalin would take over all of Germany. That was his goal. It would become one big buffer protecting the Soviet Union, in Stalin's mind, from a future potential invasion. So again, if you would write this down. So May of 1945, we're going to go backwards a little bit in time. We can do that in history. You don't have to always keep going forwards. Sometimes you can turn the clock backwards. So in May of 1945, and this ties in with the Yalta Conference, see how I'm making these connections? So again, Berlin was split into 4 zones. This part was controlled by the Soviets. This part was controlled by the French. This part was controlled by the Brits, and that part was controlled by the Americans. All right, let's continue on. So now here we go. We're back to Harry Truman. And I told you, when you look at the presidents after 4 years, notice how much they age. Their hair frequently turns gray or even white because every day, 7 days a week, the president is dealing with some type of stressful crisis. Well, guess what? Harry Truman has got a whopper on his hands right now. He has got a huge crisis that he's got to deal with. He sees this blockade that has been set up of West Berlin. The United States and its allies are responsible for West Berlin. So Harry Truman is in what we call a quandary. A quandary, if you draw a line outside, really tough, challenging situation where it seems that there's no right answer. So Number one, if Harry Truman basically does nothing, he lets the Soviet Union maintain this blockade. If he does nothing, then what's going to happen is eventually all of Berlin, East and West Berlin, would be under the control, the hegemony. There's that word I keep using again, the influence of the Soviet Union. And eventually, if Berlin is controlled by the Soviet Union, eventually all of Germany would be controlled by the Soviet Union. On the other hand, number two, if Harry Truman says, you know what, we're sending in American troops, we're going to kick the Soviets out. If he sends troops right now to break this blockade physically in West Berlin, here's what's going to happen. Draw a line off to the side. You now have World War III. And again, you notice how when you're looking at what happened or what was happening between Ukraine and Russia. Now, keep in mind, I'm recording this again back in March, early March, I should say. So I don't know how things are going to play out in the next couple of weeks when you're actually watching this. But again, that's why the Americans, up until this point, have been very reticent to get involved with its allies. They've had economic sanctions, heavy economic sanctions placed on Vladimir Putin and his oligarchs, and of course, the country of Russia. But at this point, militarily speaking, at least at this time, we're taking a hands-off approach. All right, so please write this down. So it's 1948. So Harry Truman now has got to make a choice. He's got to figure out what's the best way of dealing with this blockade. So here we go. Number one, does he go with A, you do nothing? But remember, if you don't respond, the Soviets eventually will take over both parts of Berlin and will eventually take over all of Germany. B, send in troops to break the blockade up. But if you do that, you run the risk of World War III, which nobody is prepared for at that point. Or C, I didn't mention this earlier. This is what we call thinking outside the box. So what we're going to do is we're going to go with what's called an airlift. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the United States Air Force and the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and we're going to airlift and literally drop much needed food and supplies to the folks of West Berlin. So we're not going to go through the blockade. We're just going to fly over it. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, these are mostly children over here. And this is, again, an American Air Force pilot that's airlifting and dropping much needed food to the people of West Berlin. So if you would please write this down. So when all is said and done, British and American airplanes, as part of the American and British Air Force, will airlift or airdrop much needed food and fuel to the folks of West Berlin. We estimate about 2.5 million tons. Think about that for a moment. And number two, in a relatively short period of time, over 270,000 flights were made by American and British Air Force pilots airlifting and dropping much needed food, supplies, and fuel to the folks of West Berlin. Again, we're following the path, following the precedents that originally was trying to be established by former President Woodrow Wilson, which was we should not cut and run. We have to support the people of Europe. This was something that Franklin Roosevelt, when he was alive, said, when this war is over, we're not going to go back to our isolationist ways that we did in the 1920s under Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. We're going to stay the course, and we're going to ensure that that another major war never breaks out again. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So finally, 1949, the Soviets decide that the time has come to halt the offensive. Let me rephrase that, to halt the blockade. Now, the question, of course, is why? We'll get there. I want everybody to skip a full page. I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Once again, I would like everybody to date your notes again for today. It is March 31st, 2022. And I want you to write down for me guide questions, the Berlin Airlift, 1948 through 1949. So again, this is the third of our video clips that you'll be taking copious notes on, all of which will be fair game for your next assessment. So again, I'm going to go through these guide questions relatively quickly. All right, here we go. Number one, So I want you to describe for me in more detail. I've just given you a nice overview. I like these video clips because they nicely augment what I've introduced, and then I'll dovetail back and tie it all together eventually. I want you to describe for me what the Soviets were doing in West Berlin based on this video clip. I'm going to go through these guy questions quickly again because I know that you have the opportunity of being able to pause the Zoomcast. You guys do a great job with that. Number two, hey, what was Operation Vittles? Skip a line or two. Number three, on average, how many flights did Allied pilots fly daily? Great stat question. I'm not necessarily going to ask you this on an assessment, but I could use it as a context clue or part of an answer choice. I always say to students, whenever you hear statistics, because you're not going to get guide questions when you go to Stevenson next year. They don't do that. They expect you to take notes on your own volition. Whenever in doubt, write it down. Next guide question, stats. Again, the same thing. For example, how much food and supplies were delivered on Easter Sunday, 1949? Just picking a date and how significant this was in basically saving the folks of West Berlin. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into our video clip today. It's about 3 minutes long. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen, the Berlin Airlift.
The Soviets blocked all major road, rail, and canal links between West Berlin and Western Germany. They made no concerted effort to seal every route, but delivery of the 12,000 tons of food and coal normally supplied by the West to Berlin every day was now impossible. The Soviets cut electricity supplies to factories and offices. West Berliners could do little. Their only large power station had been dismantled for reparations by the Soviets in 1945. The Berlin airlift began at the end of June. The Americans called it Operation Vittles. The British, Plain Fare. The airlift had to deliver 2,000 tons of supplies a day. Without it, West Berliners couldn't survive. They had coal for only 45 days and food for only 36. Airlift pilots could fly up to 3 missions every day. An American pilot brought his own 8mm movie camera.
I went back to Berlin to get this picture. Inside the barbed wire, kids came up on the other side of the barbed wire, looked at me in the uniform, came up and started talking to me. How many sacks of flour you got? You know, how's it going to be tomorrow? They got off the subject of flour very quickly on the subject of freedom. I said, look, he said, someday we'll have enough to eat. Just give us a little. Just don't give up on us when the weather gets bad. We'll have enough. But if we lose our freedom, we may never get it back. And these kids were 8 to 14 years old. They blew my mind with their maturity, understanding of what was important.
Halverson promised the children that he would return with chewing gum and chocolate dropped from tiny parachutes. Easter Sunday, 1949, a record 13,000 tons was airlifted in 24 hours. The gamble had worked. Berlin could be supplied indefinitely by air.
We lived
at Karlshorst and could hear the noise of the aeroplanes, which delivered everything, including chocolate and Christmas presents. We couldn't match it. We were poor, and the West was rich. And of course, this crazy blockade was bound to fail.
Finally, sheer joy, nothing else. We had done it. It does work with the West. That was so very important. The West has won.
So as that video clip wraps up, I think it was, again, very, very powerful at the very end of the clip when that gal was talking about how the West had won. But more importantly, the part that really resonates with me was the part where that one retired Air Force pilot was talking about those young Berliner kids between the ages of 8 and 14, and how they wanted their food and they wanted their candy, which everybody of kids love, but it wasn't so much about the food. I thought the part that really resonated with me was how they had said, just don't forget about us. It's about freedom. And think about what, again, has been going on in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine. It's really about the most important thing, and it's all about freedom. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for my Zoomcast for today. So what I'm going to do with the next Zoomcast, the direct instructional one, as we get into the month of April, is I am going to go and I'm going to finish the Berlin Airlift, summarize its importance, and I'm going to make a definite connection between the Berlin Airlift and its importance and what's going on right now in Eastern Europe in 2022. So I would like everybody to right now take out your correctable tape. Please go through your ISN, clean up anything you crossed out or traced over. Please remember, this is supposed to be a representation, a portfolio of your absolute optimal effort. Crossing out and tracing over is not your optimal effort. Then I want everybody to please go take different colored highlighters. Remember, especially with your video clips, guide questions have to be highlighted. It reinforces the information. Tip of the tip. Focus on those words you can visualize in your mind, the persons, places, and things. Highlighting is reinforcing the information. It's a form of natural organic studying. If you're not highlighting, you're not studying. And that could be a reason why you're not performing at your absolute optimal point on these assessments, but you're still not done. I want you to please go and take 10 to 15 minutes, and I want you to review everything that we covered today. We again talked about George F. Kennan and the long telegram. And we learned about, of course, the policy of containment, the influence it had on the Truman Doctrine, which I summarized and dovetailed back to. And we really focused on the Marshall Plan. And then we finished up, of course, with the Berlin Airlift. And remember, if you have an opportunity, hand your ISN, hand your history notebook to somebody you can work with in your house, your mom, your dad, an older brother or sister. You channel your inner Mr. Bonk. You teach the information that was covered today. If you have an opportunity, do a Zoom session or a FaceTime session with other classmates. I told you, the more you can talk about this information, the greater sense of mastery you're going to develop. It's a natural, organic way to study, not memorizing dates and facts and flashcards. That's rote memorization. Always remember, tell the story. So again, my next Zoomcast, I will go back and I will finish up, of course, summarizing the significance of the Berlin Airlift, making connection with what's going on today. Again, I hope everybody enjoyed today's Zoomcast as much as I love making them. I hope you can see it, again, hear it in my voice. And as I always like to say, as I wrap up one of my Zoomcasts, you know, the story may have ended today, but you better believe the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Peace out, everybody. Peace out. Thank you so much. And as always, please be well.